Stop checking where I go after work. You don't own me. He spat the words at me like they were poison. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. We were standing in the middle of my living room, in the apartment I'd bought long before he ever walked into my life, and my boyfriend was looking at me like I was some stranger trying to control him. My chest burned, but my voice came out colder than I expected. Perfect, I said. Just that one word. No shouting, no drama, no begging him to explain. I watched his face twist in confusion, in that way people do when they suddenly realize they've pushed a little too far, but their pride won't let them step back. He kept talking, throwing around words like privacy and freedom and space, pacing around like the victim in his own story, but I barely heard him. Something in me had clicked, like a lock finally turning after months of being jammed. That night, after he stormed off to the bedroom muttering about how suffocating I was, I didn't cry. I didn't chase. I didn't apologize for asking where my own boyfriend spent most of his nights. Instead, I waited until the apartment was quiet, until I could hear his soft, careless snoring from the other room, and then I opened the closet. I pulled out the suitcases I'd bought years ago for trips we always said we'd take together and never did. One by one, I folded his shirts, his jeans, his hoodies, his stupid jacket he swore was lucky, and laid them neatly inside. Every pair of shoes by the door, every bottle of cologne from the bathroom shelf, every little piece of him that had slowly invaded my space while he acted like I was the one trapping him. By the time the sun dipped and the city outside turned to neon and shadows, my car was full. The address I drove to wasn't in my contacts, but it lived in my memory, buried in small, careless comments he thought I'd never notice. The street he mentioned once while complaining about parking. The area he joked about when he said his coworker lived too far from the office, but the company she gave him was worth the drive. He always called her just a coworker. Nothing to worry about, just a friend, just a teammate, just someone who understood the grind better than I did. I pulled up in front of a small house in a quiet neighborhood, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment with my hands gripping the steering wheel. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but underneath the panic, there was a strange calm, a stillness. I wasn't here to beg for him back or to demand answers he'd probably twist into more lies. I was here to give him something he clearly wanted but didn't have the courage to ask for out loud, a life without me. I stacked the boxes and suitcases on her front porch, one trip at a time. The night air was cool against my skin, and with every box I set down, the weight in my chest loosened just a little. Halfway through, the door opened. She stood there, mid-30s, casual clothes, a glass of wine in her hand, eyes squinting in confusion as she tried to make sense of the woman unloading a car full of men's belongings onto her doorstep. "Can I help you?" she asked. When she realized who I was, when the pieces slid into place in her mind, the color drained from her face. A second later, he appeared behind her, wearing one of the t-shirts I'd just packed an hour earlier, his expression collapsing as our eyes met. In that moment, with my boyfriend standing behind the woman he swore was just a coworker, surrounded by boxes of his life I had so carefully packed, I felt something inside me finally snap and then settle. I had no idea my life was about to change like that this quiet, controlled act would be the starting line of an entirely different version of me. But to understand how I got here, to this porch, to this version of myself who could walk away without begging, you have to see everything that came before. You have to see the slow erosion, not just the collapse. People often assume that heartbreak arrives like a lightning strike, sudden, violent, impossible to prepare for. But mine didn't start with a dramatic moment on someone else's doorstep. It started long before that, in quieter places, in small shifts I brushed off because I loved him. Or maybe because I wanted to believe I did. My name is Linda. I'm 34, and for most of my adult life, I believed I was pretty good at reading people. I work in project design, deadline-driven, communication-heavy, detail-obsessed. And in my job, if you miss the small signs, everything collapses later. Ironically, I never applied that skill to my own relationship until it was too late. I met him 3 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. He was charming in that soft, unassuming way that makes you feel safe around him. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but when he spoke, people listened. He asked thoughtful questions, laughed easily, and looked at me like I was someone worth discovering. I remember thinking, finally, someone who pays attention. We started dating a week later. Nothing dramatic, no whirlwind romance, no impulsive confessions. It was slow, warm, steady, like sipping something comforting on a cold night. He'd text me good morning, ask about my day, tell me small stories about his job. It felt normal, safe, kind. And for a woman who'd spent her 20s surviving a string of almosts and not quites, that felt like a miracle. After 6 months, he moved into my apartment. People said it was fast, and maybe they were right, but it didn't feel reckless. We cooked together, grocery shopped together, spent Sunday mornings reading on opposite ends of the couch with his feet resting against my leg. We had routines, little rituals that made the days feel less lonely. I thought we were building a life. Looking back, I realized how much of that image existed only because I wanted it to. His family liked me, or at least they liked the version of me that never challenged him. His mother always commented on how stable I seemed, as if I were an emotional support system rather than a partner. His sister would pull me into the kitchen during holidays and ask if I was being patient with him, like he was a child needing supervision. I didn't mind it then. I thought it was just quirky family warmth, not a warning. The first cracks were subtle. They always are. He started working later. Not dramatically late, just an hour, then 2. He'd come home tired, drop his things anywhere, kiss my cheek distractedly, and collapse onto the couch. When I asked how his day was, he'd shrug and mutter, "Same old." I didn't push. I thought he needed space. I thought relationships required compromise. We went from cooking meals together to me reheating leftovers alone, from talking about vacations to barely having conversations, from him reaching for my hand while watching movies to him scrolling his phone while sitting inches away from me. I told myself it was a phase. Work stress, burnout, maybe even mild depression. Anything but what it truly was. Then the secrecy began. He changed his phone password. He started taking his calls in the hallway. His notifications stopped lighting up the screen. When I asked, gently, if everything was okay, he smiled without meeting my eyes and said everything was fine. And I believed him, even though my stomach twisted every time he left the apartment at 7 p.m., saying he had team stuff. I ignored the way he flinched when I walked into the room unexpectedly. I ignored the way his coworkers suddenly seemed to know more about his life than I did. I ignored the tiny ache in my chest every time he said, "You wouldn't get it, it's work-related." You see, betrayal doesn't start with a lie. It starts with a slow withdrawal, a quiet distancing that you don't notice until one day you wake up and realize you're reaching for someone who's no longer there. And the truth is, before I stood on that porch with his belongings at my feet, I'd already lost him. I just hadn't accepted it yet. But the universe has a way of forcing clarity on you, and mine was coming whether I was ready or not. The shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, settling into the corners of our life like dust, quiet, unnoticed, but impossible to ignore once the light hit it. It began about 4 months before everything fell apart. At first, his late nights seemed harmless. He'd always been social at work, always had colleagues he grabbed drinks with. I'd met some of them. Polite, friendly, forgettable, in the way most workplace acquaintances are. So when he said he had team dinners, or after-hours meetings, or last-minute project deadlines, I didn't question it. Not then. But frequency changes things. Patterns reveal truth. Once a week became twice. Twice became 3 or 4. Some nights he'd come home at 9, others at 10 or 11. He'd slip through the door smelling like the city, cold air, vague cologne, sometimes the faint hint of someone else's perfume. And I'd be sitting at the dining table with the dinner I'd made hours earlier, trying not to let disappointment show on my face. "How was work?" I'd ask, keeping my voice light. "Same team stuff," he'd answer, brushing past me. You wouldn't know them. Always vague, always deflecting, always shutting the door on further questions. His phone became the centerpiece of this new version of him. It was always face down, always locked, always within reach, like an oxygen tank he couldn't live without. He took it to the bathroom, to the shower, to the balcony. If it buzzed, he'd glance at me before checking it, like he needed to make sure I wasn't watching. I wasn't suspicious by nature. I never had been. But when someone changes this dramatically, your mind starts stitching pieces together, even when you don't want it to. One evening, I asked softly, "Is everything okay? You've seemed distant." The reaction was instant and jarring. He whipped around, eyes sharp. "Why are you interrogating me?" My heart dropped. I'm not. I'm just asking if you're stressed." "You're checking up on me," he snapped, trying to control my life. The accusation hit like a slap, not because it was true, but because it was so wildly unfair that it left me breathless. "I'm literally asking how your day was," I said, voice trembling. "Well, maybe stop acting like my keeper," he shot back. That night, he showered the moment he got home. Not a quick rinse. A long, steaming shower at 10 at night, despite having showered that same morning. And he'd been doing that often enough for me to notice. Night showers, lighter cologne, a new perfume scent occasionally lingering faintly on him. Still, I rationalized it. Maybe work was overwhelming. Maybe he was tired. Maybe I was imagining things. Because the alternative, that the person I loved was drifting away from me, was too painful to consider. But the universe keeps receipts, even when you try to look away. The next signs came in fragments, a slip here, a tone shift there. A coworker's birthday celebration that supposedly lasted 5 hours. A team-building night that ended past midnight. A deadline crisis that required after-hours collaboration several nights in a row. Individually, each excuse sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a story that didn't add up. And yet I stayed quiet. I held back questions because I didn't want to push him further away. I tiptoed around topics that used to be ordinary conversations. I walked on emotional eggshells in my own home, afraid that any curiosity would ignite another explosion. But silence has a cost. The distance grew thicker, like a fog settling between us. Sometimes I'd watch him from across the living room, the man I once felt so deeply connected to, sitting on the edge of the couch with his shoulders tense, thumb flying across his phone screen, face illuminated by the glow of messages I would never see. It felt like loving a ghost, someone who was there, but fading. One night, he came home an hour later than he'd said, and when I gently asked who he'd been with, he froze just long enough to betray himself. Then came the snapped accusation. Why does it matter? It was such a small moment, such a simple question, but something inside me shifted. The uneasiness I'd swallowed for weeks began to harden. My intuition, quiet, patient, loyal to a fault, finally raised its voice. Something was wrong. Not imagined, not exaggerated, not a product of insecurity. Real, growing, and rooted somewhere he refused to let me see. And though I didn't know it yet, the moment that truth would finally reveal itself wasn't far away. It was waiting, sharp and inevitable, on the other side of a Tuesday night. The breaking point didn't arrive with fire or fury. It arrived on a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind of night that should have been ordinary, forgettable, harmless. But heartbreak never chooses dramatic timing. It waits for stillness, for routine, for moments when your heart is unguarded. He'd texted me around 6 o'clock. "Work thing. We'll be home late." It wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. I made dinner anyway, out of habit more than hope. By 9:30, my meal was cold, untouched, and I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. The silence felt heavier than usual. When the front door finally clicked open at 10, he didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed to see the light still on. "Hey," I said gently. "Long night?" "Yeah, work stuff." It was the same answer as always. But this time, something about the way he said it, it was too quick, too practiced. Like he'd rehearsed the line on the drive home. I nodded slowly. "Which coworkers were you with?" He froze. Not dramatically, not with shock, just froze. Like a glitch in a system. A half-second delay that told me more than any confession would have. "Why does it matter?" he snapped. "It doesn't," I said quietly. "I'm just making conversation." "Yeah, well, it feels like checking up on me." "That's not what I'm doing." "Stop acting like I owe you a report every night." His voice rose, sharp and ugly, cutting through the room. For a moment, I just stared at him, stunned. Because this wasn't frustration. This wasn't stress. This was guilt wearing the mask of anger. "Stop checking where I go after work," he barked. "You don't own me." The words slammed into me. Not because I believed them, but because of how deeply he seemed to. Because of how far he'd twisted the narrative to avoid the truth he refused to confront. I felt something inside me grow cold. Not sadness, not fear. Clarity. "Perfect," I said. The shift in my tone made him blink. He opened his mouth, confused. "What?" "Perfect," I repeated, each syllable calm, steady, final. "You're right. I don't own you, and you clearly don't owe me honesty." His brows knit, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He hadn't expected this version of me. The quiet one, the decisive one. He followed me as I walked to the bedroom. "What are you doing?" "Checking something," I said. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and opened our shared phone plan, the one we'd combined a year earlier to save a little money. Back then, it felt like a significant step in our relationship. Now it was just a data trail he forgot existed. I scrolled through the usage details. I'd never looked before, never needed to. Until now. One number appeared again and again. Calls during lunch, texts at midnight, hour-long conversations, dozens of interactions every single day. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, but my hand stayed steady as I rotated the laptop toward him. "Who's this?" I asked. His face went white. "That's none of your business," he said too quickly. "It's on our shared plan," I replied, which technically makes it very much my business. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "He's just a coworker." "What's his name?" He hesitated, too long. "Why does it matter?" he finally whispered. "Because you've texted and called this person 50 times a day," I said. "Because you're coming home late 3 or 4 nights a week. Because you shower the second you walk in the door." His eyes darted away. "You're paranoid." But his voice shook. That was the moment something inside me broke, not from heartbreak, but from clarity so sharp it hurt. I stood up. "Pack your things." He stared at me, stunned. "What?" "Linda, come on, don't be dramatic." "Pack your things," I repeated. "Tonight you stay somewhere else while you figure out what you want. I'm done pretending everything is fine." He spluttered protests, calling me jealous, controlling, irrational. The same lies cheating partners recycle to avoid accountability. But I didn't engage. I went to the closet, pulled out 2 suitcases, and started packing. His shirts, his shoes, his cologne, his toiletries, all the things that had slowly migrated into my space while his loyalty migrated elsewhere. "You're seriously kicking me out?" he asked, voice cracking. "Yes." He watched, helpless, as I zipped up the bags and set them by the door. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, eyes glossy. "I don't know," I said softly. "Maybe to your coworker's place, the one you talk to 50 times a day." His face drained of color again, a pattern I was becoming familiar with. "I can't," he whispered. "Why not?" I asked. "If he's just a coworker, I'm sure he wouldn't mind helping you out." He said nothing, just stared at me like the truth had finally cornered him. He grabbed the suitcases and left. The door slammed so hard a picture frame fell from the wall and shattered at my feet. When the echo faded, the apartment felt impossibly quiet, and I stood there, barefoot, staring at the broken frame, realizing that something much larger had shattered long before the glass ever did. The silence after he left didn't feel real. It felt staged, like the quiet moment in a film right before a storm destroys everything. I stood in my living room, watching the door he'd just slammed, listening to the faint rattle of the picture frame that had fallen against the floorboard. A hollow ache bloomed in my chest, not sharp, not violent, just heavy, heavy enough to change the way I breathed. I should have cried. That's what people expect. But I didn't, not then. I just walked to the couch, sat down, and folded my hands in my lap like I was waiting for bad news from a doctor. Maybe because I already knew the diagnosis, just not the details yet. I replayed the past few months in my head, like flipping through pages of a book, written in a language I suddenly understood. Late-night showers, vague answers, the smell of perfume that wasn't mine. The exhaustion in his voice that wasn't from work, the way he'd flinch when I asked normal questions. How long had I been rationalizing the irrational? My stomach twisted. How long had I been making excuses for a man who wasn't even trying to hide the truth anymore? Around 1 a.m, I stood up and paced the apartment, touching the back of chairs, the edges of countertops, grounding myself in a space that suddenly felt foreign. Every corner had a memory, some sweet, some painful, all now tainted by the realization that while I was loving him, he was slipping away. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was that he'd made me doubt myself, doubt my instincts, doubt my sanity. "Why are you interrogating me?" "You're paranoid. You want to control everything." His words echoed in my mind like accusations carved into stone, and I hated that I'd believed even a fraction of them. By morning, exhaustion coated my body like a second skin. I called in sick to work, not because I wanted a day off, but because the idea of pretending to be normal felt impossible. I needed space, air, answers. At 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed. "Him. Can we talk?" "No." Then a call. I let it ring until it died, then a longer message. "I stayed at a friend's place. I'm sorry." "You're right. We should talk." A friend, not the coworker. Interesting, I thought bitterly. But none of it mattered, not yet, because something deeper than his words was tugging at me, urging me to search for the truth, not his version of it. That was when I saw his laptop on the coffee table. He always insisted he had nothing to hide. He never bothered with passwords. I had never looked. But today was different. I sat down slowly, like I was approaching a wild animal that might bolt. My fingertips hovered over the trackpad. A whisper in my mind said, "Don't do this." Another answered, "You need to know." I clicked open his messages. And there he was, the coworker. Their messages scrolled back months. Light-hearted at first, sprinkled with emojis and inside jokes, then deeper, longer, more intimate. Not explicitly physical, but emotional in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Late-night confessions, plans to meet by the lake, conversations about dinners, drinks, long walks. Him telling her things he hadn't told me in months. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My chest tightened until it hurt to inhale. Then I saw it. Her message sent 2 months ago. "I wish things were different. I wish we'd met first." His response? "Maybe we did. Maybe this is just bad timing." Her reply? "Or maybe it's perfect timing. Maybe I'm finally realizing what I actually want." The words blurred, not because I cried, still I didn't, but because something inside me finally cracked. A clean break, a truth too sharp to ignore. And then I saw the final blow. The night I kicked him out, she sent, "He kicked me out. Can I come over?" His answer? "Not tonight. My roommate's home. I'll see you tomorrow." There it was. The truth distilled into a single exchange. She was his secret escape, but not someone he cared enough about to help when things got real. I leaned back on the couch and exhaled slowly. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger requires energy, passion, attachment, and all of that had drained out of me like water through cracked hands. I was tired of lies, tired of pretending, tired of being made the villain in a story he wrote to justify his guilt. I forwarded the screenshots to my email, not for revenge, not for leverage, but because I needed a record. A reminder that my intuition wasn't wrong, that I wasn't wrong. When I closed the laptop, the apartment felt still again. But it wasn't the stillness of shock anymore. It was the stillness that comes right before a decision. Steady, quiet, irreversible. He had taken something from me. Trust, stability, peace. But I was about to take something back. Control. Escalation doesn't always look like shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it looks like silence tightening around your life, like a rope slowly being pulled little by little until you finally feel the burn. That week, the days right after I discovered the messages felt exactly like that. Tight, suffocating, surreal. By the next evening, he had texted me 3 more times. "Can we meet? We need to talk. You misunderstood everything." I didn't reply. Not out of spite. If anything, spite requires emotional investment, and mine was running dangerously low. I stayed quiet because I wanted distance, clarity, and the space to breathe without his excuses clouding my mind. Around 5 p.m., he sent another message. "I'll stop by tonight to get the rest of my stuff." I stared at it for a good minute, feeling an unexpected calm settle through me. No, he wouldn't, not on his terms. Instead, I started boxing up everything he'd left behind. Not carelessly. Carelessness would have meant I still cared enough to be angry. No, I boxed things neatly. Folded his shirts, wrapped breakable items, stacked his books in order. It felt like I was closing a chapter by physically removing his presence from my space. By the time I finished, my car was filled. 3 trips down the stairs, each one lighter than the last. As I pulled out of my building's parking lot, my phone buzzed again. Him. On my way. I ignored it. I was already driving to the address from his messages, the one he thought he'd hidden, the one she lived at. A small part of me wondered what I'd say if I saw them together. Another part of me hoped I wouldn't have to say anything at all. But fate had a sense of precision. When I pulled up to the house and began unloading boxes, the front door opened. He stepped out, holding a beer in one hand, wearing that confused expression people get when the story they've been telling themselves finally collapses. "Linda," he said, voice cracking, "what are you doing?" "Returning your things," I answered, lifting another box from my trunk. "You said you needed them." Before he could respond, she appeared behind him in the doorway, her eyes widening the second she saw me. "Linda?" she whispered, voice trembling. I didn't stop unloading. I didn't break eye contact. "You can't just," she started. "I can," I said calmly, and I did. The look they exchanged, hers full of guilt, his full of fear, wasn't triumph for me. It was confirmation. Confirmation that my intuition had been right all along. But escalation wasn't just happening on that porch. It was happening behind the scenes too. Because after I drove away, after I blocked his number and hers, everything began unraveling on their end faster than I expected. Mutual friends started reaching out. Some cautiously, some eagerly, some in whispers, afraid to be caught in the middle. Apparently, the moment I left, things inside that house shattered just as loudly as the picture frame had in mine. He'd turned to her, furious. "You said you were staying with a friend," he accused. She froze, cornered now on two fronts. "You didn't tell him we lived together?" I had asked her before leaving. And apparently, that question detonated everything. Because he didn't know. Not about our 3 years together. Not about the apartment we shared. Not about the life we'd built. She had manipulated both of us. Me to buy time, him to maintain fantasy. Their fight that night was so loud neighbors complained. She tried spinning the story, painting me as controlling, paranoid, needy. But he had seen the boxes. He had heard the truth from my mouth. And he wasn't interested in defending her lies. He told her to leave, told her to never contact him again, told her she'd ruined everything. But drama doesn't disappear once you close a door. Over the next few days, she tried calling me from different numbers. I didn't answer. She sent long messages through mutual friends, explaining how things weren't what they looked like, how she never meant to hurt anyone, how everything got complicated. Complicated. A fascinating word people use when they don't want to say the truth. I made choices, and now I don't want the consequences. One friend, someone who knew both of us, called me with a hesitant voice. "She's telling everyone you were controlling," he said, "that you kicked her boyfriend out because you were insecure." I laughed softly. Let her talk. But people are asking questions. Then let them ask. Because I had something she didn't. Evidence, facts, truth that didn't require theatrics. Meanwhile, her work situation began to crumble. Too many late nights, too many blurred boundaries, too many personal issues bleeding into professional life. When he filed a complaint about her behavior, accusing her of harassment, HR decided the easiest route was termination. Actions meet consequences. Cause meets effect. His life shifted too. That coworker relationship he'd gambled everything on, it turned out he had an on-again, off-again girlfriend he'd never mentioned. Someone he returned to within weeks. Someone he proposed to not long after. A perhaps cruel twist, but not one I added. It was simply the truth. While their world caved in, mine grew quieter. There were no screaming matches, no revenge plots, no desperate last conversations. Just distance, space. Healing disguised as solitude. I changed the locks, cleaned the apartment, donated things that weren't worth keeping, reclaimed my routines. I heard from a few people that I was too harsh, that I should have given him a chance to explain. But explanations don't erase messages. They don't erase patterns. They don't erase betrayal. He had so many chances to be honest. He used every one of them to lie. And as their lives fractured, mine slowly, quietly began stitching itself back together. Escalation wasn't a war. It was the world correcting itself. And for the first time in months, I felt like I was standing on solid ground again. The days that followed looked calm from the outside. Anyone passing me on the street would have assumed I was fine. Maybe tired, maybe distracted, but fine. That's the thing about heartbreak. It hides well. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic grief or loud collapse. It creeps, slow and steady, into the quiet spaces you thought were safe. The first real darkness came the night after I delivered the boxes to his coworker's house. I returned home to an apartment that felt too big, too quiet, too empty of the familiar footsteps, the off-key humming he did while brushing his teeth, the faint smell of his cologne lingering on the couch cushions. I had reclaimed my space, yes, but reclaiming it meant facing the truth. I was alone again. Not the peaceful kind of alone, not the chosen kind, the kind that wraps around you like cold water, forcing you to feel every bruise you'd tried to ignore. I sat in the living room with the lights off, surrounded by the faint glow of the city outside my windows. My phone lit up occasionally. Friends checking in, messages I didn't have the energy to answer. His number didn't appear anymore. I'd blocked it, but I still expected it to. That anticipation, the ghost of his presence, hurt more than any message he could have sent. I pulled my knees up to my chest on the couch, hugged them, and buried my face in the fabric. I wasn't crying, not yet. But the pressure behind my eyes felt like a storm gathering. How did I miss this? How long had he been slipping through my fingers? Why wasn't I enough to keep him? That was the darkest thought, the one that cut deepest, the one betrayal always whispers. If you had been better, he wouldn't have left. I knew it wasn't true. Intellectually, logically, I knew betrayal was a choice he made long before I realized anything was wrong. But logic rarely wins against the emotional shrapnel left behind. At some point, I wandered into the bedroom, not because I wanted to sleep, but because everything felt heavy. I lay on the side of the bed he used to occupy, staring at the empty space beside me, remembering the way he used to curl toward me in the mornings, half asleep and warm. I whispered into the dark, "What did I do wrong?" The room didn't answer. I pressed my palm over my chest, trying to steady the ache there. My heart felt bruised, tender, vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt since my 20s. I hated that a person who had lied so effortlessly could still hold any space in my heart. It felt unfair, to me, to the version of me who had loved without holding back. Hours passed, maybe minutes. Time blurred, the way it does when you spiral. The darkness deepened the moment I thought about the possibility that he had loved her more than he ever loved me, that maybe he laughed more with her, confided more in her, found parts of himself with her that I never got to see, that maybe the person I thought he was existed only for her. The thought hit like a punch to the ribs. I turned on my side, curled in tighter, and finally the tears came, quiet, restrained, almost embarrassed to exist. Not loud sobs, not dramatic breakdowns, just silent tears sliding across my nose and pooling into the pillow. I cried for the relationship I thought we had. I cried for the woman I'd been before I doubted myself. I cried for the trust I'd given so freely. I cried for the 3 years I couldn't get back. At some point, my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it until I saw the notification preview. His best friend. We hadn't spoken much during the relationship, but he wasn't unkind. He had always struck me as perceptive, someone who watched more than he spoke. I unlocked my phone and opened the message. "I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that." Just that. No excuses, no explanations, no sides taken. And for some reason, that simple sentence gutted me more than anything my ex had said in months. I typed back, "Thank you." He responded almost immediately. "He lied to all of us. You're not the problem." The tears came harder then, not because I needed validation, but because I hadn't realized how much I needed someone, anyone, to acknowledge I wasn't losing my mind. A few minutes later, another message arrived. "If it helps, he's not doing great. Everything blew up. Not your fault." I didn't reply, not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't absorb more information without drowning. I locked my phone and lay there in the dark, listening to my uneven breathing. I wasn't proud of how broken I felt. I wasn't proud of how small betrayal can make even the strongest woman feel. But I also knew this moment, this low, raw, fragile place, was necessary. Pain forces clarity. Loneliness forces introspection. Darkness forces you to find your own light. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "You're going to be okay." I didn't believe it yet. But the act of saying it, of claiming even a sliver of hope, was the first stitch in the process of healing. The turning point didn't arrive with triumph. It didn't feel powerful at first. It felt quiet, subtle, almost unremarkable, like waking up one morning and realizing that the heaviness in your chest doesn't hurt quite as sharply as it did the day before. It started 3 days after my dark moment. I woke up before sunrise, not because of anxiety, but because my body had finally had enough of lying in the same position, replaying the same memories. I sat up slowly and looked around my room. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the weight of his absence pressing against the walls. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar: space, breathing room, possibility. I walked into the kitchen to make coffee. The apartment still echoed with a little too much emptiness, but the quiet no longer felt like punishment. It felt like a blank canvas. As the coffee brewed, my phone buzzed with another message. Not from him, but from a mutual friend. "There's more you should know." I stared at the text for a moment before typing, "About what?" He replied almost instantly, "About what he told us and what he told her." My heartbeat picked up, not from fear, but from anticipation. Not because I needed details, but because I could finally handle them. We spoke on the phone, his voice low and hesitant. "I'm not trying to stir things up," he said. "But he lied to her about a lot. Lied to us, too. Said you two were on a break. Said you were unstable. Said he barely lived with you." I laughed, a hollow sound. "We lived together for over 1.5 years." "I know," he said. "I just thought..." You should hear it from someone neutral. Neutral. That was the key word. Someone not trying to protect him. Someone not trying to soften the truth for my sake. When the call ended, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not numbness, clarity. A clarity I hadn't felt since before the deception began. I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the screenshots I'd saved from his laptop. The flirtatious messages, their late-night confessions, his hesitation to let her stay with him after I kicked him out. All of it formed a picture far clearer than anything he'd ever said to my face. And slowly the narrative shifted. For weeks I'd been asking myself, why wasn't I enough? Why did he choose her over me? What did I do wrong? But now, looking at the evidence, the emotional chaos, the lies layered on lies, the cowardice, I realized something monumental. It was never about me. It was never my deficiency. It was his. He hadn't chosen her over me. He had run toward the easiest escape, someone who didn't know the real version of him yet. The version who lies when life feels inconvenient. The version who builds fantasies instead of taking accountability. And when reality arrived on her doorstep in the form of boxes I stacked myself, he couldn't even give her consistency. That wasn't love. That wasn't passion. That wasn't loss. That was dysfunction, and I had survived it. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled deeply, feeling something inside me click into place. A voice inside whispered, "You deserve better. You deserved honesty. You deserved respect." And he was never capable of giving that. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, painting the apartment in warm gold, another moment pushed me further toward transformation. He tried to contact me again, this time through an unknown number. The message was short. "Please, just talk to me." I stared at the message, waiting for the familiar sting. It didn't come. There was no ache, no longing, no curiosity about what he might say. Instead, I felt done, truly, genuinely done. I blocked the number without responding. My hands didn't shake, my heart didn't race. And for the first time since everything collapsed, I felt a rush of something that tasted like freedom. That evening, I took a long shower, the kind where water becomes a second skin, warm and cleansing. I washed away the perfume traces that weren't mine, the memory of cold, late-night kisses, the heaviness of every argument dressed up as misunderstanding. When I stepped out, steam curling around me, I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes still held sadness, yes, but beneath that, I saw resilience. A woman who had endured lies and gaslighting and emotional erosion, and had somehow found her footing again. I whispered to my reflection, "You're not broken." And the best part? I finally believed it. The turning point wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't closure from him. It was the moment I realized that healing didn't require his apology. It required my permission. Permission to let go. Permission to rebuild. Permission to move forward without dragging his chaos behind me. For the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath me, steady, solid, mine. And I knew, deep down, that the fallout awaiting him had nothing to do with me. It was simply the consequences of choices he made, long before I stopped loving him. Fallout doesn't explode all at once. It spreads, slow, messy, inevitable, like the aftershock of an earthquake. And in my case, it didn't fall on me. It fell on him, on the woman he'd chosen to betray me with, and on the fragile reality he'd built on lies. The first ripple came through mutual friends. I was cooking dinner, something simple, something grounding, when my phone buzzed with a message from someone who'd always stayed neutral. "Are you okay?" I typed back, "I'm fine. Why?" A beat. Then, "Because everything is blowing up on his end." I set the phone down and leaned against the counter, inhaling slowly. Not from excitement, not from bitterness, just from the weight of inevitability. He had spent months juggling lies, and now gravity was catching up. That friend called me later, voice low. "You know the girl he was seeing?" he asked. I said nothing. He continued anyway. "She found out everything. That you lived together, that you were together for years, that he wasn't some broken, misunderstood man in a failing relationship. She didn't take it well." I pictured the scene, not out of pleasure, but out of understanding. Lies unravel fast when truth enters the room. "What happened?" I asked quietly. "Massive fight," he said. "Neighbors complained. He told her to leave." There was a pause before he added, "He deserved that, you know." I didn't answer. Deserving was between him and whatever conscience he had left. The second ripple came from her workplace. One of her colleagues, a woman I barely knew, sent me a message out of nowhere. "I heard what happened. She's not doing well." I typed back, "I'm not involved anymore." "I know," she replied, "but HR got involved after he filed a complaint." I closed my eyes. Because, of course, he filed a complaint. Cowardice doesn't disappear simply because someone else's life falls apart. He said she was harassing him, the colleague continued. They let her go. I exhaled slowly. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was exhaustion. The kind that comes when you realize people you once cared about are capable of destroying not just relationships, but themselves. The third ripple came from him directly, though he didn't reach me, not anymore. He used friends, acquaintances, anyone who might try to mediate. One message said, he regrets everything. Another, he says he was confused. Another, he wants closure. Closure. The word tasted bitter. He wanted me to patch the hole in his conscience, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because he couldn't stand the idea of being the villain in his own story. But he had made himself the villain. I had simply stopped participating in the performance. I sent one final message to the friend trying to defend him. There's nothing left to discuss. Please stop bringing him up. He didn't message again. And still the fallout didn't stop. Weeks passed. Life quieted. I started reclaiming pieces of myself, taking long walks, listening to music I'd stopped playing, cooking meals that felt comforting. I wasn't healed yet, not fully, but I was breathing again. Then came the final ripple, the one that closed the chapter entirely. A mutual friend texted me. He got engaged. I stared at the message for a long moment. Not in shock. He'd always needed someone else to hold up whatever identity he was building. Not in jealousy. My heart had long moved past anything resembling love for him. It was something else. Something like clarity. Something like affirmation that the universe had taken me out of a situation I was never meant to stay in. Apparently, the woman he got engaged to was someone from his past. An on-again, off-again girlfriend he'd been circling back to for years. Someone who, like me, had once believed he was capable of something stable. I hoped, for her sake, she'd eventually learn what took me 3 years to see. And just like that, the fallout ended not with an explosion, but with a dull, quiet thud. His consequences had landed exactly where they belonged. On him. On his choices. On the lies he'd woven to keep 2 relationships afloat until they inevitably sank. Meanwhile, my world was slowly rebuilding itself. I changed the locks on my apartment, not because I feared he might return, but because it felt symbolic. A closing. A boundary. A declaration of space that was wholly and entirely my own. I cleaned every corner of that home, scrubbing away the final traces of his presence. The forgotten hoodie behind the chair, the old receipts and drawers, the scent of a life I wanted nothing to do with anymore. I donated things that held no emotional value. I kept nothing that reminded me of him. I allowed myself to exist without the weight of explanation or apology. Some people whispered that I was too harsh, that I should have heard him out, that relationships deserve conversation. But I knew the truth they didn't. He'd had hundreds of opportunities to be honest. He'd used every one of them to lie. His fallout wasn't my burden. His consequences weren't my responsibility. His healing, if he ever chose to face it, wasn't my job. I had already paid my cost. Now he was paying his. And with every passing day, with every breath that came easier, I understood something powerful. I wasn't the one who lost in this story. He was. He lost someone who loved him honestly. He lost stability, trust, safety, truth. He lost the chance to grow into a better man. All I lost was a lie. Healing didn't arrive with fireworks. It didn't sweep in dramatically the way heartbreak had. It came quietly, in small moments I didn't notice at first, like the way I stopped checking my phone expecting his name to appear, or how the apartment began to feel warm again instead of hollow. One morning, about 3 months after everything, I woke up and felt light. Not healed entirely, not transformed overnight, but lighter. The kind of lightness that comes when you finally put down something heavy you carried for far too long. I brewed coffee, opened the windows, and let fresh air fill the rooms he had once suffocated with secrecy. The sunlight spilled across the floor, and for the first time, I didn't think about the nights he never came home on time. The lies he wrapped himself in, or the woman he thought he wanted more than me. I was simply here, present, alive, my own again. I started doing the things I'd stopped doing when I was too busy holding together a relationship he had already abandoned. I hiked alone. I traveled on weekends. I spent time with friends who never made me doubt my worth. I tried new recipes. I read books I'd bought but never opened. I took myself out to dinner and didn't feel embarrassed about sitting alone. I rediscovered the version of myself that existed before the heartbreak, and she was stronger than I remembered. People sometimes whispered that I should have forgiven him, that I should have listened to his explanations. That closure requires conversation. But those people misunderstood something fundamental. Closure doesn't come from hearing someone justify their betrayal. Closure comes from recognizing the betrayal for what it is and refusing to water the same garden where you were poisoned. Forgiveness is not an invitation to re-enter someone's life. Healing is not permission for them to return. Strength is not measured by how much pain you can endure, but by how calmly you can walk away from what hurts you. In the end, I didn't hate him. Hate requires energy, and I was no longer willing to give him any part of me. Not my anger, not my sadness, not my time. I simply let him go. I let the story end where it needed to end. I let myself begin again. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't anger. It isn't confrontation. It isn't proving your worth to someone who never valued it. Sometimes the greatest revenge is peace. The kind that settles into your bones quietly. The kind that doesn't demand attention. The kind that radiates from you when you finally choose yourself. And if there's one lesson I carry from all of this, one truth I want anyone listening to remember, it's this. Losing someone who doesn't see your worth is not a loss, but losing yourself trying to make them see it, that is. Choose yourself before you disappear. Choose your peace before you drown. Choose your truth before their lies define you. Because in the end, the woman I became mattered more than the man I lost.